Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest Brexit news on Take Back Control, as British businesses are urging the UK government to get a move on with adopting EU rules that we didn't create in order for them to continue trading. All that guff from Brexiteers about leaving the EU would make us rule makers instead of rule takers. No, it's the other way around. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the EU have passed legislation which means that from 2025 they will refuse to import goods which are directly or indirectly linked with deforestation. Specifically, it will mean that they will refuse goods which cannot prove that they do not fall foul of this legislation. Lots of lovely red tape incoming, which would be massively reduced if we introduce legislation to do exactly the same thing. Now, as it happens, the good news is we are doing so. Or we've said we're doing so. But retailers are concerned that we seem to be dragging our feet on this. The problem is that unless the UK introduces this legislation, then suppliers can't be bothered providing the documentation that proves their goods are not linked with deforestation. After all, why would you? If you can legally export to Britain goods which are associated with deforestation, what's your incentive to go to all the trouble to provide paperwork that proves that it meets the standards of a completely different market? But those goods have been used in our own production with the intention of exporting to the single market. Exporters here will find themselves unable to prove to the EU that their goods meet those standards because they won't be able to get the paperwork. But if the UK government legislates, as it said it would, then we won't be able to import anything that doesn't meet those same standards, which means those suppliers all of a sudden will have to provide the paperwork, otherwise they won't be able to sell to us. UK producers and exporters can then demonstrate to the EU that what they're trying to export to the single market does meet the standards. And that is the issue in a nutshell. If the UK government don't pull the fingers out, then we're going to find even more of our products simply cannot be exported to the EU, hitting economic growth, throwing our balance of trade out even further, to say nothing of the impact on ordinary people, potential job losses, certainly lower tax revenues for the government, meaning either cuts to public spending or a higher rate of tax, which is already the highest for generations. And even though there's over a year before the government technically need to have this in place, there's a sense of urgency from British businesses because they need to plan ahead. Are the government going to do this or not? Because that matters for their business plan. The government say they will, but they say a lot of things. At the start of this month, the Transport Secretary was given a speech where he was saying that the government was completely committed to HS2, including the Manchester line. A few days later, none of those lines were going to be completed. It could just be argued that after the past few years, businesses have come to the conclusion that actions speak louder than words when it comes to Tory promises. But there's another aspect to consider as well. The reason the government have promised to introduce this legislation is purely to be allowed to continue to trade in affected goods with the EU. In other words, the EU have adopted legislation and we are following. If the EU had not adopted this legislation, we would not be doing so. What's happening here is that our Parliament is going to implement an EU law which was not decided by anyone that a UK citizen living in the UK voted for. Now, this is exactly the sort of behaviour that Brexiteers attacked in arguing for us to leave the EU in the first place. We keep having to doff our caps and implement these rules from Brussels. Should be British politicians decided our rules, not Johnny Foreigner. Only it was British politicians deciding these rules. British politicians, along with their counterparts in Germany and France, were the most influential legislators in the EU. It's why the UK government, the one in Westminster, the UK government, explicitly supported 98% of all EU laws while we were members. Only 2% of them were the ones that we'd rather not have, or rather not have in the form they were agreed in. And when you consider that EU law was only ever a few percent of all the laws active in the UK anyway, 2% of a few percent, that's a really tiny number of laws that we adopted, which our government wasn't all that keen on. The fact of the matter is that in the EU, the UK were rule makers. UK citizens got to vote for some of the most influential rule makers in the EU and, by extension, driving standards around the world. And that is exactly why our economy flourished whilst inside and has done so poorly since. Because now we have become the very thing Brexiteers moaned about. We have now become rule takers. This rule about banning goods linked to deforestation, it was passed by the EU Parliament earlier this year. No members of the EU Parliament were voted for by the British people. No UK representation on either the EU Commission or the EU Council. This is a rule that was made without us having any say whatsoever. And yet, we're going to adopt it. Parliament's technically already voted through the groundwork for it. The government now need to introduce the secondary legislation. They're going to do that. We're going to make it UK law. And that's not because our government is weak. It's because if we don't, then a load of British products will be banned in our most important export market. We will lose trade, our GDP will suffer, there will be jobs lost, tax revenues will go down, hitting public services. It's really that simple. We were always going to be following EU rules. If you want to export to the EU, you follow their rules. If we want to travel to the EU, we follow their rules. This is why Labour are keen to align as many of our standards with the EU as we need to protect our trade. This is because it's not enough for British producers to meet the standards of the EU if they want to export. They have to be able to prove it meets those standards. That means red tape. And the more we diverge, the more red tape is required and the harder and more expensive it is to get that red tape sorted. As we diverge, we make it harder for British exporters, which means we sell less, we make less money, we need fewer workers and all the rest of it. If we realign, we make it easier. We boost trade, we boost production, we boost the number of jobs, preferably good jobs. It's really that simple. But even as we pragmatically realign our standards, which we're going to do, the Tories are already doing it, Labour are going to accelerate that process. As we realign those standards in order to make trade easier, we will still be what Brexiteers moaned about. We will still be the rule takers. Even if we join the single market again in future, whether bit by bit or as part of a major treaty, we will still be rule takers. And that is because we are always going to adopt laws decided by the EU Parliament. And if we're going to adopt those laws anyway, it really is a choice of, do we want a say in what those laws are or not? Because if we do, then we need representation in the EU Parliament. And there's only one way to do that. We rejoin not just the single market, but the EU proper. But of course, if we're happy being rule takers, if we're happy adopting laws that might have been modified to be more in our interests, if we had a say, but, they're not going to be because we don't, well, then fine. We can carry on outside the EU, aligning with their standards in order to be able to sell to them, doing exactly what a foreign parliament has told us to do. Because that's what Brexiteers have actually been urging us to do all along. When they talk about trading more around the rest of the world, people are going, oh no, we trade more around the rest of the world. Well, no, not only was this nonsense, the rest of the world's far away, but they were urging us to comply with laws decided elsewhere even then. If we want to export more to Japan, we're going to adopt laws that Japan has told us to adopt. Increasing our exports with Australia means adopting laws that Australia has told us to adopt. If we ever get a trade deal with the US, it will mean adopting laws that the USA has told us to adopt. But when we were in the EU, we were adopting laws that we decided. And if ever we want to set those rules in the future, rejoining is the only way we will be doing so. Leaving the EU was never about taking back control. It was giving it away. Where is our control now? Where is our control over the rules for exporting to the EU? Where is our control over the rules for exporting to Asia or North America? We have no control because we don't vote for the people who decide those rules. Taking back control would be rejoining the EU. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.